Thank you, Rena, and thank you everyone for coming this morning. So Rena kind of captured my background, and today I'm really excited to talk to you about data governance because it combines two of my passions, technology and law. And I'm going to talk to you about data governance through those lenses, technology and law, because I think data governance is an initiative that's not the sole responsibility of either a data scientist or a lawyer or the business folks in your enterprise. It's a combined initiative, and it really should be a shared responsibility. And what I would like to leave you with today is the idea that data governance is important. It's important for both maximizing the returns on your investment to assimilate and integrate and to get your data lake together. And it's also important to minimize risks that arise when you're doing data projects. And I thought what I would do is start by describing my journey to machine learning, because I think it has shaped my ideas about data governance as much as my legal background has. And so I came to machine learning by way of advanced process control. So advanced process control is the precursor to computational process control that many of you may be familiar with. And I'm a chemical engineer by background, and much of my research involved minimizing process variability in chemical processes like polymerization or iron ore processing or circuit board manufacture. And as part of that process, I use neural network models to identify assignable causes to shifts in process quality, for example, in polymer production. And then try to integrate statistical process control with feed-forward and feedback control using a few parameters identified through these neural network models. So it should come as no surprise that much of my thinking in this space is shaped by W. Edwards Deming. And as you may know, Deming is famous for his work in Japan after World War II, where he had a significant impact on Japanese manufacturing and businesses based on his work on statistical process control. And specifically, a number of Japanese manufacturers, including Sony, applied his techniques widely and experienced unheard levels of quality and productivity, which led to the popularity of Japanese products globally. And, I have here one of his famous sayings, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And, the understanding here is that when you have data, you need data to understand the systems that you're trying to improve. And as a young engineer, I took that to heart. I took it to mean that, you need lots of data. And when I saw lots of data, I was excited. But very soon I learned that, it's not just enough to have lots of data. You need the right type of data. You need rich data. You need data that captures the variability that of the process that you're looking to improve. And then as I started to roll out models and saw how they were being used and sometimes saw how they were not being used, I started to focus more on the second quote that I have here. And it's, nobody should try to use data unless he or she has collected data. And this, I think, for me, has become a mantra, not just in my engineering work, but also, as I help companies, develop and commercialize their machine learning projects. Because the idea here Deming is talking about is that if one hasn't personally collected data, you may fail to understand the judgment calls that go into assigning and recording a result from real-world connections. And for me, I had the opportunity, based on the applications that I was building, to actually have a very close understanding of the data that I was collecting. So I would interview the operators that would record data. I had the opportunity to actually go out in the field and look at the sensors that were collecting data. By understanding the process, and this is a little interesting because we use data to try to understand the process, but then we also have to understand the process that gives us the data so that we can identify the gaps in the data. So it's a bit of a recursive and iterative process to understand the data that you're collecting and then understand the system based on the data that you've collected. And I was able to understand the gaps in my data collection based on the understanding of the processes that we were trying to optimize. But now, given the complex data sets that were we're working with right now. They come from many different sources. They're being used for various uses. They may be coming from processes that, where there's very little understanding, where, the collective understanding is not held by one person, but amongst various groups of people. And it's really important to understand where that data comes from and what rights there you have to use that data, what gaps there are in that data. And, I think data governance is a good collective means of ensuring that we have that understanding to minimize risks when we're building machine learning models, and then to maximize the investment that we've made in collecting all this data. So, going back to, the first quote that I mentioned, in data we trust. In God we trust, and, otherwise bring data. What type of data should you bring? And, I've listed here some types of data that I think I would like, and I'm sure if there's something that I've left out, please feel free to let me know what you think is the type of data that you would like to bring to your projects. But, valid data, data that is truthfully captured, rich data, data that captures the variability in your process, data with consent. That was something that I didn't really have to deal with as an engineer because I was working with industrial processes. But as we work with real-life data, we work with processes that are trying to mimic real-life processes and consumer-driven processes. Consent is becoming increasingly important. Have we collected the data with consent? Have we told people how we're going to use the data? And at a baseline, have we told people that we're collecting their data? The second part is data that is understood. And I've sort of shied away. Initially, I would talk about biased data, and I've sort of shied away from that, term biased data, because essentially, it's not the data that's biased. It's our systems that are, either providing this data or that are sourcing this data that are biased. And really, the data is just the data. It is, it is essentially saying what the system is, and what we really need to do is to identify whether the system itself is biased. And that can only come through some type of understanding or some type of analysis on the data to identify that bias. So, I talk about data that is understood, and then data with broad rights. So as we do our machine learning applications, we want to ensure that we're building our models with data that we have rights to use. Because, as we'll talk about later, if we don't have rights to use that data, then that in turn affects the value of our models, whether we can use them for what we want to do, or whether we can actually capture the value or the dollars that we put into gathering that data. So I thought this would be a good time to touch on some of the risks. As a lawyer, I deal with risks. Every day it's about risks, identifying risks and then trying to resolve them. And then as a last part, we're not just about saying no when we identify a risk. We also try to help you mitigate that risk. So how can you navigate and ensure that you can still build your model even if you've identified risk in your data collection processes? So some of the trends that we've been seeing in regards to data and how it's sourced and collected and used in machine learning are as follows. So there's increasing regulatory concern about how data is sourced. So essentially when the regulators are concerned that companies are sometimes using data that they don't have rights to. So for example, companies are relying on nebulous or very broad terms of use in their privacy policies, where when people interact with a website, they leave a digital footprint, and they may not understand clearly what their data is going to be used for. So one of the things that we're trying to get companies to be aware of is that when you use data, ensure that you have the rights to use that data and you've collected it with consent. Another thing that we're seeing is that large enterprise companies themselves may have siloed data. With the integration efforts, that siloed data is now being pooled and can be used across the enterprise. But then the concern is, does everyone in the enterprise have the same rights to use as the very first person who or the very first business unit that collected the data? So that's something else that we've been dealing with. Companies are increasingly licensing data from third parties. So again, the concern here is that do you have the rights to use that data that you have licensed? And have you ensured that the person who's licensing you the data has the rights to share that data with you? And then companies are also collaborating in unique ways and enriching data from using third-party data sources or third-party data platforms. And you want to ensure when you're enriching that data that you have the rights to use that enriched data when you're building your machine learning models. I also help companies that are either acquiring technology or selling technology. And in the M&A and investment space, investors are becoming increasingly savvy as to how data is being used in machine learning models, and how they can affect the value of the machine learning models. So I personally have been involved in a number of deals where data used to build a machine learning model has been scrutinized. So, investors will take a look under the hood to see, have you sourced data from public data sets? Do the public data sets allow commercial use of that data? Have you collected data from your customers? Do your customer contracts allow you to use that data? And oftentimes, depending on the clout of the buyer, they will either go back to the developer and say, rebuild your models, taking out that data set. And if it is a particularly important data set, and you rebuild the models, you may not be able to guarantee, the prediction based on this new or this limited data set. So it can really hinder a deal, and in some cases, it completely destroys the deal. So it's important when you're building your machine learning models to really, start at the first step, which is to make sure that you have the rights to your data. I think sometimes people have the misconception that if there is no law in place, there is no risk, there's no legal risk. But there are other types of risks. There are operational risks and reputational risks. And we've seen that arise in a number of different ways. For example, if, not a number of we saw the concern about insurers sharing health data with Google, where, there was concern that patients were not made aware that that data set was going to be shared with Google. So, the reputational risk there is quite high, even though there may be limited legal risks in that context. And then, based on, those are the large legal risks. So today in Canada, what are the risks that, we should be concerned about or what we should be aware about? And, I think one of the things as Canadian companies, as Canadian, there's increasing awareness that Canada is a powerhouse when it comes to AI. Our models are used globally, or we have global investment, or it's become easier to attract a global customer base. And when you have that kind of, verdant ecosystem, you also run against global privacy laws. And right now, our regulators are taking a look to see what's happening across the pond. So, everyone's aware of the GDPR. It's probably the most stringent set of privacy regulations. And you're aware that there's, onerous fines, onerous conditions to comply with it, specifically in regards to AI with the right to explainability and the strong prohibition in using data that gives rise to biased results. And what our Canadian regulators are wanting to do is to kind of impose that sort of model where we have more investigatory powers, larger fines, and that should, give companies pause for concern to realize that, even though our law is not there, it may be heading that way. And so, there's no need to wait for that prohibition or that requirement to come down, you really could start moving your processes to account for this governance practice. Similarly, when companies, build up their platforms and scale up, they may hit against global regulation, privacy regulation. So I mentioned GDPR. Down south, it was a bit of a Wild West for quite a while. There wasn't as much privacy regulation, but with now the California Consumer Privacy Act, we're going to see more type of GDPR regulation coming to the west coast of the U.S. And it's interesting to note that these are the kind of things that you have to be aware of when you're developing your systems. So for example, both the GDPR and the CCPA have this right to portability. So if you have, if a customer provides you with data and they use your platform to, in other words, store their data or to use your products, you have to provide them with the ability to transport their data, to move their data to another provider, which means that you have to build in interoperability standards into your platform. So having an awareness of what the privacy regulations are is important, not just from a data governance perspective, but just as you design your processes around data as well. And then lastly, I think consumers are becoming a little more aware that their data can be used in ways that they didn't really originally consent to. We've seen a number of high-profile concerns where consumers give consent to use data for a certain use, and then the company changes or pivots to adopt a new business strategy, and suddenly they need to use the data in a different way. Well, when they don't obtain consent, customers will push back. So there was a recent situation in the U.S. in regards to a company that provided cloud storage services for photographs, and they essentially, in their terms of use, received permission to train their AI model so that customers could better sort and collate their photographs. Well, this company then pivoted and decided that they were going to provide machine learning models to the military for facial recognition applications. And when customers heard that their photographs were now being used for these military-type applications, they were livid. And that resulted in a huge backlash in the company. So these are the type of things that people have to be aware of. We have global privacy regulation. We have, more stringent requirements around the protection of data. And then we also have consumers who are becoming increasingly aware and concerned about how their data is being used. And so the question then becomes, how do we stay on top of this? How do we account for this changing landscape? And how can we also do it in a manner that lets us reap the rewards of all the investment that we've been making to, enrich our data sets, to grow our data sets, to license new data sets? And, there are a couple of things that we've been working with companies with, a number of enterprise companies or companies that are working in a particular sector are finding it increasingly helpful to be able to share data in a way that, complies with legal requirements. So one thing that we've been seeing are data sharing initiatives where, a company will take it upon itself to be the data steward. And, it could be either a corporation or a public authority or a public-private partnership. And then there's a legal framework in place that, governs how data is contributed, how it's used, and how what the implications are if data is not used in that way. And so, this can give people comfort, especially when there are initiatives like smart cities, where there's a huge mass of data and it's not clear how that data would be used. We've talked about data protection, and really that's an ongoing process, having processes in-house to ensure that your data is stored and used in compliance with applicable law. And then a global privacy compliance program, and this is something that I think that should not be developed in isolation. It should be developed in a siloed manner. Your legal teams and your technical teams should be talking because it's not just a matter of not doing something, but it's a matter of doing something right. And so much of the privacy requirements aren't just around not making your data available to everyone, but it also means operationalizing some of the ways that you use data. And so, I know we have limited time, and I wanted to just give you a sense of the importance of data governance, the fact that it should be an important part of your overall strategy for rolling out machine learning applications, and then I wanted to put it in context of how it would be viewed in regards to your entire management of your AI project. So, as I mentioned, lawyers are always concerned about risk, and we're always concerned about mitigating that risk, or, that's what we get, that's our mandate. And so, I put here a sample framework here for mapping risk and to identifying and understanding what the consequences are if that risk arises and the probability of that risk arising. And this is a sample exercise for mapping risk. Based on your project, it may not, the risks may be different, the consequences will be different, and the probability of them arising are different. But here, I think I have an example here of an autonomous vehicle. And if I had had time, I would have had something that had like a stronger privacy risk. But you see in this particular application that we did, the privacy concerns were quite low. But once you do this kind of mapping exercise, it's possible that based on your compliance initiatives and your governance projects, the privacy risk is quite low. And so you can focus on trying to mitigate risk like product liability or your regulatory risk, for example, when it comes to self-driving cars. And, I always tend to talk about data governance as part of a spectrum of a responsible AI innovation framework. But as you can see, here I've kind of listed what I think a framework would be, defining the mission, data governance, dealing with bias, explainability, and accountability. And you see, the basis of it is data governance, because, without having a clean, a data set that is compliant with law, that, mitigates risk, you will not be able to reap the rewards of all the dollars that you've spent in, integrating with other platforms or integrating with other sources of data, or just the infrastructure projects that you've done. So I hope the takeaway here is data governance is important. It's an activity that should be shared between both the legal and the technical folks. And without it, you really do impact the value of your machine learning projects if it's not dealt with initially. Thank you.
It was a very interesting talk, and I think this exposes to the stuff that happens outside of the data science core development work. My question is around concept of moral hazard, right? Like in insurance, there is the idea that I think it was around seatbelts, that when seatbelts were first introduced, they actually increased the number of fatalities because people started taking risks that they otherwise wouldn't have. So I'm kind of curious, do you see any evidence, or have there been any studies to show organizations that are at least claiming to have excellence in data governance, whether it's around risk, privacy, ethics, they're more likely to misuse data or anything along those lines? I'm kind of curious, how does that initiate a false sense of lull in the organization mindset?
I think that's a really interesting question, because, and I think, I think what happens there is, are you lulled into a false sense of security because you have a packet of processes in place? And, I think that is not the end of it. It needs to be operationalized. So, your lawyer can draft up a set of documents, and your lawyer can also, get input into drafting those documents. But then thereafter, there has to be a process in place to ensure those, it's a living, breathing document that's being, complied with, that's being updated. And, I think that's something that we try to tell people, just because you have a policy against, to mitigate against a data breach, doesn't mean that you don't have to be careful that you don't actually have a data breach. So it's something that, we try to drill home. And I think most of our clients are quite, they get that point. And I think given the huge fines and the reputational risk, I think it's something that companies that do go, spend the dollars and, create these compliance programs, they're very much aware that it has to be executed as well.
Hi. I think most of us in the industry and working with ML and that kind of and other data governance is very well aware of regulations like GDPR and CCPA and things like that. I recently heard about the California law that is coming into effect in January 2020. And other states in U.S. could follow suit as well and come up with similar things. So how should organizations and even small organizations approach that to be compliant with all those regulations coming up and moving targets so that it doesn't become a burden and you have to kind of really revamp and update your policies, procedures, and always be compliant because things you did yesterday are out of compliance tomorrow until something new happens or it's created?
That's a really good question, because you can get the updates. You can have a lawyer who tells you, this has changed, you can't do this. But I think building it into your databases and vetting or, sort of having some lineage to your data to know where it came from and to know at any time what rights you have to that data. So, for example, if you have data from a California consumer, what type of data is it? Can you use it for every machine learning model? Can you use it for every use? And so what we have helped clients who collect huge data sets is to build these kind of metrics into their data or characteristics into their databases so they know at any time what data, what consents they have for that data, what uses they can make for that data, whether consent has been revised for that data. And then, given that we know that global regulation is always changing, we need to have some means of ensuring that the data in our databases is marked in a certain way. And I think, when I started doing this talk, I actually wanted to title, "What color is your data?" And essentially that's what it is. You have to have a map of your data, and you have to know what data is green, what you can do anything. And then there's going to be certain data that's red or orange, where you're going to have limited rights based on, whether the consumer has withdrawn consent or whether there's some change in the law that requires you to have consent but you didn't get consent for. And so it's a matter of tracking the law, tracking the consents, and tracking it on a real-time basis. And there are some of our clients that are quite good at doing this and ensuring that, at any time the database that they're using to build their models is compliant. But it's really something. And then there are others, that I've had discussions with where it's they have no idea what data they have, whether they have consent for any of the data, or where it comes from, or who provided it, which is concerning.
First, let's thank Laila for all the time.
Thank you very much, everyone.